end of World War II. And you ask the question, what happened between the end of that war and 1973? A whole generation. What happened to incomes of various different groups in America? And this chart gives you the first indication of what that looks like. I've taken everyone in America, all households, or families in this case, and I've divided them up into quintiles. That is, the bottom 20%, that's a quintile. The second quintile, a little bit richer. The middle quintile, kind of the middle. The fourth, and then the top quintile. And what's really fascinating, when you look at this period that I call the post-war glory days in one of the books I did some time ago, what was fascinating about that time is we had the most rapid economic growth in our history. Median household income, median family income, the income of the middle family, literally doubled after controlling for inflation in a single generation. Jesus. And yet what was most fascinating is those people at the bottom saw their income grow faster than anyone else. So the bottom quintile saw their income grow by 116%. This is in inflation dollars, between 1947 and 73. Faster than the middle group, which grew only 98%, and significantly faster than the richest 20%, who grew only about 85%. So we had rapid growth, growing equality. This is not good. If we look at the following period, 1973 to 2000, you'll see just the opposite. Right? First of all, income grows very slowly, and huge share of total income goes to the top. The lowest quintile, and I'm not talking about per year, I'm talking about the entire period of 27 years. The lowest quintile sees their income in the United States go up by only 12% between 1973 and 2000. The middle quintile goes up by about a quarter. The top quintile goes up by about 67%, about 2/3. So we go from rapid economic growth and greater equality to slower economic growth and significant inequality. And then if we take it up a little bit further and we look at the 2000 to 2004 period, which we had a very deep recession, the last time we had a deep recession before the current ones, you can see what happened there. The bottom lost 8% of already their very low income. The middle, about 2.6%. The top quintile, only about 2%. So again, during the boom in income, the greater income growth before the recession, the rich got most of it, and when the recession hit, it was the poor that lost. And if you look at it in terms of the growth in real household income between 79 and 2003, you can see what happened in terms of the growth, and you can also see the top 1%. So we can just isolate the very richest 1% of all families, which in 2003 had an average income of over $1 million, right? Between 79 and 2003, their income more than doubled. The lowest fifth, which had an income in 2003 of an average of less than $15,000, over that period from 79 to 2003, saw their income go up by 1%. So when we talk about inequality, and when Dr. Wilkinson shows us what the impact is, this will give you some idea of just how much we're talking about. If we then crank it out and really look at the top, right? The very, very richest, the richest half of 1%, the richest 1/10 of 1%, and the richest 100th of 1%, a very small number of households, you'll see the richer you are, the faster your income grew. So that for the very top 1/100th% of all families, their income went up by about 156% in just 5 years, between 1995 and 2000, while at the bottom 90%, not the poorest, these are the bottom 90%. Many of us in the room are in the bottom 90%, went up by 12.5%. So the longer we look at this period, after 1973, the greater and greater and greater inequality becomes. If we look at tax cuts in 2006, you'll see that the lowest quintile benefited magnificently from the tax cuts that were passed in those years. They gained an average of $63 that year. The wealthiest 1%, who had seen their income explode between 2005 and 2005, saw their average tax go down by $45,000. Okay? One of the things that economists have looked at is the whole question of why? What caused this? And I've been at a number of conferences over the last 20 years that have tried to explain how could so much inequality have occurred. And most economists will look at one cause. Most of them will say, well, it all has to do, as I'll say in a minute, with how technology is evolving, helping the very smartest to become even richer, and helping those who have the least education very little. And others would say, well, it has to do with free trade. And others will say it has to do with the lack of unionization or something like that. Well, in 1991, 20 years ago, I wrote an article called Murder on the Inequality Express. And I put it in the American Prospect, although to my chagrin, they took out the words murder on when they actually published it. It's known as the Inequality Express. And the point I was trying to make is that inequality exploded so rapidly that you couldn't just blame it on one suspect. For those of you who know the wonderful Agatha Christie mystery, Murder on the Orient Express, the denouement of that novel is that Hercule Poirot finds out, when he finds out the killer, it wasn't one, it was everyone on the train. And that's basically where this title came from. So if we look at it, the first suspect in our mystery is technology. So we get technology, it favors those with skills as technology becomes more and more important in the economy, and it is a real problem for those who have less skill. A second is deindustrialization. 1982, I wrote a book with my late colleague Ben Harrison called The Deindustrialization of America. I grew up in Detroit, some of you may remember. And growing up in Detroit, the richest city in America in the 1950s and 60s, it was phenomenally rich because it had a massive industry called the auto industry, which was growing and booming, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of workers, and thus millions of people, including their family, became reasonably well-to-do, even if they had relatively modest skills, putting together Fords and Chryslers, General Motors, Studebakers, Hudsons, Frasers, and a whole bunch of other cars most of you younger in the room have never heard of. Okay? And then we lose that industry. And with that industry, we lose well-paying jobs, and people see their incomes decline. A third had to do with deregulation. We began to take industries that were very profitable. We deregulated the airlines industry, the bus industry, the over-the-road trucking industry, communications industries, and we saw downward pressure on wages as a result of that. And we saw declining unionization. In the 1930s, we had a unionization density rate of about 35%. It's down to about 12%. The result is that you have people who had very good wages, even though they had modest skills, losing their union jobs. Still another was downsizing of companies, going from big companies that could afford to pay bigger wages to smaller companies that may not have been able to do it. Another was this idea of winner-take-all labor markets, that a very small proportion of the total workforce in any firm was getting more and more of the benefits. The CEO who's making 400 or 500 times the janitor's wage as opposed to 30 or 40 times. And you had free trade, the idea that we opened up our markets so that now we had people who particularly had less skill having to compete not only with other lesser skilled workers here, but competing with lesser skilled workers in China, in Vietnam, in Latin America. And we had capital mobility. It wasn't just that jobs were going abroad, investment was going abroad. We were setting up whole plants. Ford, which was my employer back in the 1960s, built a plant in Hermosillo, Mexico to assemble Ford Fiestas. And what they took down there was not an old, decrepit plant. It was a state-of-the-art Ford assembly facility. But they hired people at the same wages as they had in the old plant, which had, very low productivity. The productivity soared, the wages stayed the same, and Ford became extremely profitable in that Hermosillo facility through capital mobility. Suspect 9, some would say, was immigration. We had people who came over here who competed with jobs. This is kind of an argument you hear often from the right wing. And there may be a little bit of the inequality due to that. And then finally, trade deficits themselves. If you're running trade deficits with massive imports and much less exports, again, this could all have this kind of effect. So the point I want to make is, if you want to begin to understand the extent of inequality, you have to realize there's a whole lot of stuff going on here. And later on, the role of government in X in this course, think about these 10 suspects when we get into our conversation. Finally, I want to just finish on a couple other points. We talk about income inequality. And the fact is that the real problem, some would say, is not inequality, it's income mobility or the lack of it. If in fact we had inequality, but once a child is born, they have the same chance of becoming rich as another kid born somewhere else, you might say, well, it'd be good to have less inequality, but as long as there's mobility, that you have a chance to get ahead, maybe it's not so bad. But in fact, there's very little income mobility in the United States. So for instance, if you look at households in the lowest quintile in 1969, that's that 49.4%, right? Half of those families in the lowest quintile in 1969 were still in the lowest quintile in 1979, 10 years later. Or if you look at the other end, those who were in the top quintile, right? 5%, right? They were 5% who would end up in the lowest quintile, having fallen from the top to the bottom. And if you look at the lowest quintile, the green one here, only 3.3% of those who started in the lowest quintile ended up in the top quintile. Most were on the diagonal. You ended up where you began. And if we looked at it later, a decade later, if anything, it gets worse. Less income mobility. Now we got 53% rather than 48, 49% along the diagonal. Okay? If you looked across countries, you'll also find that we're among the lowest in terms of income mobility, the ability to transform yourself into another part of the income distribution. If you take the United States with an index value of 1, only Richard's country, the United Kingdom, seems to be a little bit below that. But you'll see other countries where there is twice as much and sometimes even 3 times as much mobility between quintiles than in the United States. Okay? What gets you out of the bottom quintile? Well, being white helps. Being male helps. High school education helps a little bit. Going beyond high school is really important, right? Going to college, really important. If you start in the bottom quintile, but somehow you make it through college. That's not the ticket, but it's part of the ticket to get out of the bottom quintile. Being a homeowner helps a little. Having a spouse, hardly at all. If you increase the amount of hours you work, helps a little bit. If your spouse increases his or her hours a little bit, it's education. And education here gives you an idea of how important it is in terms of the percent change in real hourly wage by education from 73 to 2005. If you had less than high school, you lost 16%. If you had an advanced degree, you gained 24% over that time. And then you can ask the question, well, what are the characteristics associated with entering the bottom quintile? So you're doing pretty well. You're in the middle class. Might even be at the top. What would knock you into the bottom quintile? Well, if you're white, it actually reduces the probability that you're going to fall. Right? You've got a built-in life raft. Anything that's negative here says you're less likely to fall into the quintile. If you're male as opposed to female, you're a little less likely to fall into the bottom quintile. If you're a homeowner, you're a little less likely. If your spouse is living with you, you're less likely. If there's another adult who might be working, you're less likely. The one thing that can clobber you in America is disability. You have an accident, you get sick. That's the one thing, particularly in a country with the health system we have, that can really knock you into the bottom quintile. Let's talk a little bit about wealth inequality. So far we've been talking about income inequality. That is, the amount of income that people earn in a given year. Wealth, of course, is what you accumulate in terms of assets over time. And as you might imagine, wealth inequality is even greater than income inequality. What you may not know is how much greater. So let's ask the question, how much of various kinds of income and assets does the top 1% have, which is the blue bar? Well, the 1%, this is back in 2004, when we had good wealth statistics, the top 1% of all households had about 17% of all annual income, right? That's the blue bar in the first one. Go to the middle, net worth. This is including the value of your home, okay? The top 1% had a third of all net worth in the United States. 1/3. The bottom 99% had the other 2/3. And then if you said, what about net financial assets? Stocks, bonds, mutual funds. The top 1% had 42% of all of that, okay? If you look at the bottom 90%, they had only 19% of all net financial assets. Bottom 90% have 19%, top 1% has 42%. And another way to look at it is, it's not only bad, it got worse between 62 and 2004. The top 1/5 had 81% of all net worth in 1962, up to 85% by 2004. Bottom 4/5 saw it drop. Okay? Then if you go a little bit further and you don't look at all net assets, but just look at the stock market holdings, equities, stocks. The top 1% had about 37%. If you combine the top 10%, the top two bars, the top 10% have essentially 4/5, 80% of all stock market holdings in 2004. And then finally, let me close by just saying, well, what about the most recent trends? We've been looking at data that's ancient. It's 4 or 5 years old. Let's bring it up to date. So here are the latest statistics that came out literally just a week and a half ago from the census for 2010. And let's look at what happens to average or mean, real, that's inflation adjusted, household income, all in 2009 dollars. So adjusted so it's in 2009 purchasing power. The lowest quintile in 1967, more than 40 years ago, had about $9,000 worth of income in 2009 dollars. By 2010, they had made it all the way up to $11,000 in spending power. That's the lowest 20% of all households in America, right? If you look at the middle family, they had about $40,000 back in 1967 in today's buying power, and they gained about $8,000 over that time. If you look at the highest, they had $100,000 was their mean income in 1967. In 2009 purchasing power dollars, they've seen their income go to $166,000. So stagnation. And if you look at the last decade, 2000 versus 2010, decline for every group, but look at the decline from 12,006 to 10,008 versus an $11,000 decline for the very rich, given what happened to our housing market, given what happened to our stock market. Okay? So another way to ask the question I thought was kind of neat is, how much did real median household income in 2009 purchasing power change between 1967 and 2010? Well, between 67 and 2010, the lowest quintile saw their income rise by almost $1,900. The middle third, middle class people saw it rise by about $9,000. The highest saw their income rise by $67,000 in real purchasing power. Okay? What does that translate into? Well, that little $2,000 $1,900 is still a 21% increase. It's not much dollars, but it's a 21% increase. But for the highest, it's not only a large increase in dollars, it's a 67% increase percentage-wise. And then what happened most recently? 2007, December 2007, the recession begins. starts to decline. Who gets whacked? The lowest quintile, down 9%. Middle quintile down 6.2%. The highest quintile down by 4%. That's what we have. This just summarizes it from 1974 to 2010. Lowest quintile in real dollars down 23%. Highest quintile up by 15%. Lots of numbers, right? Lots and lots of numbers. It gives you an idea of what we're talking about. So take that as baseline stats. With the exception of that little murder on the Inequality Express, I didn't talk about theories. I didn't give you any good ideas about what caused this. We may get back to that. But our next two speakers are going to talk a little bit about what they think is important. And I want to introduce, as I said, my dear friend Jack Maguire. Jack and I go back to our very first month together at Boston College in September 1971. I went there as a young professor of economics, and he went there as a theoretical physicist. Unfortunately, Jack did not remain, or fortunately, Jack did not remain a physicist. He became the senior vice president for enrollment management at Boston College. And because of that, Boston College brought in a phenomenal group of students, some of the best academics that Boston College ever saw. And of course, he also brought in Doug Flutie, which changed the future of Boston College. Jack's gone on the basis of having created all kinds of new tools for universities to use in enrollment management to form a company in which something like 73 members of his family now work, as far as I can tell, and I met them all this week, including his lovely wife who's here, Maguire Associates, which works with something like 500 universities and colleges in helping them put together their enrollment in their freshman class. Jack is also going to introduce Richard, Jack Maguire.